Welcome everyone to Bus Simulator 18 coverage here at Knee Pit Gaming. Today's video is all about controller configuration for the Logitech G920 wheels. Now this configuration and this video might help you with some of the other wheels, but specifically I am using a Logitech G920 wheel. So what we will not be talking about are things like the Xbox controller and how to set that up, or keyboard steering, keyboard slash mouse steering and driving. We will not be talking about those. This is specifically about steering wheel and specific steering wheel of Logitech G920. So let's go ahead and get into it. Before we get to the actual calibration page and settings, I do want to point out a couple of settings that I use here on the main game tab, and that is the force back intensity. Right now, we're still very early. The game was just released today, but right now I'm liking the feeling of 20. It's not too heavy. Because you have to do a lot of steering sometimes in this game, and I didn't want a very heavy setting, and 20 seems to be working pretty good. Brake strength factor, actually 1.0. I have not had to change that because the brakes actually feel really good to me as is. And then head movement amount, I have taken that completely off because I generally don't like the head movement in games. Sometimes it starts to make me sick, so I've completely taking that off. So those are just some things to give you an idea of some of the options that I have related to the actual driving of the buses. So let's get into the controls. One thing to pass along before we move on to the steering wheel section is one of the first things I tried to do was actually go through here and set up some of the options in here with buttons on the steering wheel. I tried to do some of the mapping in here and it simply doesn't work. Now, again, the game was just released, so maybe we'll get a patch somewhere along the way that will allow this to work, but it did not work for me at all. And one of the things I really wanted to do was look to the left and look to the right. I really felt like I needed to map that to the steering wheel. It would not allow me because actually, as we can see on this next screen, when we get to it, these options are not even on that screen. So that is a bit of a problem. And then the way they've got these mapped by default didn't make any sense to me either, but that's beside the point. What we're here for is the steering wheel mapping. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Now I'm going to leave this unchecked here for just a moment before we get started, because one of the things we're going to do in this video is we're going to go about trying out some different things. So it's not going to look like this for very long, but this is how I am currently playing the game. And again, I'm going to keep coming back to this. The game was just released today, so I fully expect there to be patches and updates released over the next at least week to 2 weeks that will change some of these things, and who knows, it might force me to come back in and change some of my settings. But as of released a few hours ago, the game was actually released, so as of now, these are the settings that I am currently using. All right, so keep in mind that as we talk throughout this video, I will be referencing the various items over here on this side, but we'll also be pointing out the various numbers that you see above the steering wheel angle itself, and then of course the throttle and the brake pedals along with the numbers over here. So keep that in mind. We're not just looking over here to the right hand side of the screen. We'll be referencing both sides of the screen. So let's go ahead and start off by letting you know that if you have a Logitech G920 wheel, the game does not recognize it and have a configuration loaded for you by default. I have no idea why that is. It is a very common wheel. In fact, the Logitech DF-GT, which I owned for seemingly 10 years before this, is included with a default configuration, but the G920 is not. So for whatever reason, it is not. But from my perspective, it was not very hard to set up at all. So you start out by setting up your throttle configuration. Again, the game recognized my throttle pedal without any issue. Then we move on to the throttle scale. Now for me, the including descriptions from the developers were kind of hit and miss. Eventually I was able to figure out what most of it meant, but only through a lot of trial and error. So the scale. What you want this to be is, number one, you want it to be a negative. We'll see what happens whenever you change this value in just a moment, but somewhere around negative 1.0 is where most people should be. The reason why mine is at 1.1 instead is because I'm actually going to press the pedal right now, and again, we're looking on the left-hand side of the screen. We're starting out at 0.0. That's where you should be from the beginning. And then if I go all the way to the floor with the pedal, full travel is 1.0. That's what you want. But I have had some issues on and off with my throttle pedal and full throttle not wanting to always show up as it should. So the calibration is a little bit off sometimes on that. So I gave it a little extra beyond 1.0 just to make sure that I get to full throttle. So let's go ahead with that in mind. So negative 1.0 should be the default, and that's where I would start before I make any adjustments. So let's go back to, let's say, somewhere around 0.5. Okay, so my foot is not on the throttle pedal. Again, we're back over here to the left. Full throttle, 0.5 is all I get. That's when I full travel of the pedal, I only get to a 0.5. So you notice that the number you put here, negative 0.5, well, that's all you're going to get. That's maximum throttle for you. So you don't want to do that. Now, there are maybe an instance or two where you might need to use that. But if you don't need to, I would go with the -1 or somewhere thereabouts, depending on the calibration of your wheel. Somewhere in that range. Now, let's test out and see, okay, what happens if I go to +1 or thereabouts? Okay, now, you notice my foot is off the throttle pedal and it is registering full throttle. What this means is that in the game, you're will be under full acceleration, and then you will actually have to fully depress the throttle pedal in order to stop the bus. So this is actually the opposite. If you want to trigger the opposite for this particular pedal, that's how you would do it. I don't really know why you would, unless you have something going on with maybe combined pedals or something like that. But that is what happens if you go into the positive side. The positive side will reverse the calibration and actually make it so that your throttle is on by some amount the entire time, and you will actually have to press the throttle to reduce the amount of throttle. So generally speaking, you wouldn't want to go with a positive number here, and somewhere around -1.0 is going to be your default, and then you can try to work with it from there. Now, offset. This is going to correlate strongly with what you used for the scale. Let's say that we went with a -0.5. Okay, and we've already seen that foot off the throttle pedal. Again, we're back on the left-hand side of the screen. Foot off the throttle pedal, we have 0.0, and fully depressed, it is 0.5. We talked about that to begin with. Now, with the offset, what I can do, because the game wants to have a 0 to 1 range, what the game really wants you to do in order to get your full throttle back, it wants you to use whatever number you used here in a negative, use it in a positive way right here for this value. So we used the offset of 0.5 to counteract the 0.5 up here, and now watch what happens. We're at 0.0, and now suddenly we're back up to 1.0. So this is the behavior that is going to closely mimic what we would have gotten had we left this at 0 and this at roughly -1. I mean, these numbers are very hard to get right on the money, but somewhere around -1.0 and 0 here is the same thing. So again, this offset you really shouldn't need to use unless you've had to do something severe with the scale. Now, dead zone is pretty self-explanatory. If you've done a lot of driving games, you're familiar with the dead zone. What that means is they're giving you the ability, if again, you maybe have some calibration issues, or if you don't want the game to recognize when you barely press the throttle, in this case, or maybe the brake button or something like that. If you don't want it to recognize that, then you'll put a little bit of a dead zone in here so that you can actually depress that. It's kind of useful if you find yourself resting your feet against the pedals and maybe it registers a little bit. You can nullify that with the dead zone. But for me, I want to keep this at a 0, and I want all movement to be triggered and recognized in the game. Now, throttle exponent. I leave mine at 1.0 because I want a nice linear graph, meaning that the farther down I press the gas pedal, the more throttle input the game registers. That's what we generally want. But let's see what happens if we go to 2.5. Okay, now instead of a normal mapping, now I get it, it's a little bit slower and it's a little bit more clunky to me. It doesn't feel as precise as what we had before. somewhere around 1. 1.0 is very smooth. Now, what happens if we go down to, say, 0.3? It goes extremely quickly. So if you want to go from no throttle to full throttle very quickly, then you want to lower this number. The lower this number, the more you're going to get there. The higher this number, the slower the response is going to end up being. So again, if we throw something at it, around 5.0, it doesn't even register that my foot is on the throttle until I get somewhere around 30% of the way down. So again, if you want a slower throttle response and have a harder time getting to full throttle, then you want a higher number here. And the reverse is true if you want very quick response and make it very easy to get from 0 throttle to full throttle, you want a low number here. Okay, again, you can see with this low number, it's very hard to get anything under about 70% throttle. Okay, so that's how that works. Now, we're not going to go over the exact same thing down for the brake because, of course, we have the same options. But if you will notice, in fact, while I'm thinking about it, before I get myself messed up, let me put this back at where I had it. There we go. And then I'm going to go back to about negative 1.1 for now. Throttle Exponent 1.0. There we go. So brake scale, again, same type stuff as what we're looking at for the throttle, but the difference for me is that based on the calibration of my brake pedal, at the default negative 1.0 that we talked about earlier up here, the game doesn't even recognize that I'm pressing the brake pedal down until it gets somewhere around 25 to 30% of the way down. That was no good at all for me. So it made it very erratic, and I almost had to go full braking or very close to full braking to get the game to recognize my brake. By reducing this to negative 0.5, what happened was the game immediately, like you can see here, I have very fine control of small amounts of braking. Again, we're looking on the left-hand side of the screen next to the brake pedal. So now I have very fine control. Now, you may not have to do that. It's all based on your calibration. So in order to offset this and make sure I could go all the way from 0 still to 1.0, I needed to use the offset like we talked about for the throttle. So I'm using a negative 0.5 here, so I need to use a positive 0.5 here for the brake offset, so I still get 0 to 1.0. Same thing here with the dead zone that we talked about with the throttle. I am not using a braking dead zone. And then brake exponent, I want a nice smooth 1.0 here, so a nice smooth linear fashion of braking rather than a very slow braking response or a very quick braking response here. Same thing with the wheel. Let's go ahead and scroll down a little bit there. The steering wheel scale, again, 1.0, very nice and smooth. Now, one thing I do want to point out here for the wheel scale, and this is something that threw me off at the very beginning. Right now, let's look at the steering wheel and the amount of rotation, the degrees of rotation here on the left-hand side of the screen. I am going to turn my wheel 90 degrees to the right. Okay, so now my wheel is 90 degrees to the right, and you notice on screen it is definitely not 90 degrees to the right. It's closer to 45 degrees to the right. Well, that told me that, okay, I need to up the exponent or the scale or do something with it to make that register. Well, so I did that. And boy, was that a mistake, because as soon as I got in the game, I realized that this is very misleading. You may not find that to be the case, but for me, it definitely was. So that's something you'll definitely want to check. I would highly recommend, as soon as you put whatever settings you decide on here in this screen, go into the game and move around on the street just a little bit, turn your wheel back and forth, and see if the wheel on screen in the bus matches what you're doing in real life. If they do match up, then you're golden. If they do not, then you'll know, then you can come back in here and make some choices. But again, the same rules apply with the exponent, the dead zone, and the scale, just like what we've looked at in back up here in depth with the throttle. So keep those things in mind. But again, just as I've mentioned a few different times, I want to remind you that we are still very early after release, and I do expect some updates to be forthcoming for the game that could change some or all of these values, but These are the values I'm using right now, and they're working quite well. The game has a nice feel right now for me, and I'm really enjoying it. So thank you very much for joining me, and stay tuned for more Bus Simulator 18 coverage here at Knee Pit Gaming.